Welcome to this episode of the Fertility Podcast. I'm Natalie Silverman, your host. You'll be hearing from Kate Davis, my co-host, in a very short moment. This is a brief intro to the intro because I just want to tell you a couple of things. If this is your first listen to the Fertility Podcast, this is all about educating and empowering you on the next steps that you are thinking of taking, need to take one, to understand more about taking when it comes to building your family. And if you've been listening to this podcast for a while and haven't yet subscribed, did you know you can do it in Spotify? Go do it, or whichever is your favourite podcast app. But subscribe, rate, review and share, please, this podcast, because we love it when you do that. And our reviews are getting more and more so, and it's lovely having round numbers as we end the year because it's December. How on earth did that happen? Now, rest assured, we're going to be doing a very important kind of survival guide episode before the end of the year to make sure you can start the new year with some specific tools that you might need to just cope with whatever has gone on, whatever hasn't happened, whatever might be happening. We will make sure it is a useful one to have in your ear holes over the festive period if you're not quite feeling where you want to be and you're going to be having a load of family around you asking you all sorts of things. Don't worry, we have got your back. Before we hear from Kate and myself, who did this episode in the same place, which is always lovely because it doesn't happen very often, I want to just share a couple of messages from some lovely sponsors who are supporting the podcast, and that's what makes it happen. Here you go. Did you know that by removing toxins and fertility-damaging chemicals from your daily products, improving your diet and taking the right supplements, you can improve your chances of conception and having a healthy pregnancy? Fertilibox.co.uk is the first health, beauty and lifestyle shop for people trying to conceive, where every product has been tested and endorsed by a team of experts, and it's entirely safe to use. Subscribe now and get 20% off everything, including subscriptions, with the code FertilityPoddy20. Assured Fertility specialises in 2 types of IVF plans to help you save money and increase your chances of having a baby. Unlike almost every other refund plan available, Assured Fertility 100% refund IVF includes absolutely everything required, which means there's no hidden costs. For example, drugs and consultations are all part of the package. And they have plans available at top clinics across the UK. Assured Fertility's 100% refund egg donor IVF plans are available in over 10 clinics in Europe. And if treatment is unsuccessful by the end of your plan, you receive all your money back. Please note terms and conditions do apply. Now, they also have the multi-cycle plans with up to 2 cycles of IVF and all embryo transfers included, and prices for that start at £5,950. Assured have got such a highly experienced and professional team. They offer superb customer service with support for you at every step of the way during your journey. So to find out more and have a chat with one of their friendly patient coordinators, visit assuredfertility.co.uk. So here we are, sat in the same place. That's quite exciting. It's disgusting weather, and I think that you can probably hear the rain.
It is biblical proportions.
I've come to visit Kate because if you've listened to us for a little while, you'll know that we normally are waving to each other on WhatsApp, and so I've made a trip from Manchester. If you're listening outside the UK, I've come about, how many miles from Manchester to...
I don't know, it's 2.5 hours on the train, wasn't it?
2.5 hours on the train, 2
Down
trains.
South, almost.
Midlands,
I suppose.
To come to Kate's beautiful pad. And I do want to take a picture of that.
Do you?
Explain what that is.
So that is what Natalie's pointing at is a really nice picture on my wall which has got a certificate and a medal and me jumping in the air halfway up Kilimanjaro, and beneath that is a picture of me at the very top where it's very, very cold and I'm really wrapped up.
So impressive. Because I only learned that recently that Kate had climbed Mount Kilimanjaro when we were speaking to Jessica Hepburn on a previous episode.
Yeah, but you know what? It's quite commonplace. Lots of people have climbed it. But for me, it was a massive personal challenge.
I don't know anybody else that's climbed it.
Don't you?
Do you know lots of people that's climbed it?
I do know other people, yeah. I mean, I might say...
Can you count them on 2 hands or 1 hand?
Probably that I know personally, 1 hand.
So that's pretty impressive.
But my children are sick to death of me talking about it. Well, they say I talk about it a lot and I don't. And then they'll look at me and go, oh, so you've actually climbed Kilimanjaro, have you?
Get them to go and do it and then come back and go,
that's
you know,
what I
Mum, that was
said.
pretty impressive. If you have climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, I want you to email us. That email is info@thefertilitypodcast.com.
And I would love to hear your experiences about Kilimanjaro, if you've done it, or any other mountain.
Yeah, any mountain that you've
Other
climbed.
mountains are available.
Yeah, definitely. 3 Peaks, wherever you are, just let's get some impressive mountain achievements going on, and then I think we could maybe share the certificates. Does everybody get a certificate when they climb a mountain and a medal?
I'm assuming you do for others. I bet there's a massive, big certificate for Everest.
The bigger the mountain, the bigger the certificate. Well,
Jessica can show us that one.
We'll get that from Jessica, and I'm going to get that picture. Anyway, we digress. So, as well as Kate's impressive Mount Kilimanjaro certificate, we're also joined by Isla the dog. And in a previous episode, Isla was making some quite amusing noises, and we introduced the hashtag Isla. And she's a gorgeous golden retriever. I love Labradors. We used to have a black lab as my family dog.
Did you?
How
They're
old
very
is
similar.
How old is Isla?
She's 7, we think, but she's looking a bit grey.
Isla came to me with her little teddy in her mouth, and I thought I was with my son, because he normally comes to me not with his teddy in his mouth, but she was kind of nudging me for attention when I'd walked in. So Kate and I have joined up today to have a good old chinwag about the future plans for the podcast, because you'll know now that we've been co-hosting for about 6 months, and we've been enjoying it, so we're going to carry on.
That's gone really quickly.
Has gone really quickly, and I explained in last week's episode that we were publishing this content as well on UK Health Radio. That's no longer happening, so you're not going to hear us talking about that anymore. I just wanted to clarify, because I know it was a bit confusing. So the place to get your podcast is on your favourite podcast app. So if you haven't yet subscribed, do so, and then you can rate and review, and you can share this podcast, because we love knowing about different people that are discovering it all the time, and Isla's coming to get involved.
No, she's looks like she's going to cut her toenail, so that is going to be noisy.
Is that what she does?
Yeah.
Does she trim her own?
Yeah, she does.
Dogs are fascinating, aren't they?
Yeah.
We're really looking forward to sharing this chat today, and one of the things that Kate and I are doing whilst in each other's company is coming up with our plans for next year, because the podcast is now 5 years old. If you've been listening since the start, you'll know that a lot of topics have been covered, but there's still a lot more to be covered, and we always really welcome your input. If there's things that you're wanting to know more about, do let us know. That email again is info@thefertilitypodcast.com. We're talking about surrogacy today, aren't we?
We are, which is a fascinating subject, and one that I think seems to be changing in the UK, which is for the better, which is a really, really good thing.
We're going to be talking to Natalie Gamble from NGA Law Associates, which is her law firm that she set up, hearing her story and the amazing work that she's been doing. There's been a lot of kind of conversations about surrogacy. It's such a hot topic, about the changes in the law, and Natalie will explain where they're at. I've talked about surrogacy before, and make sure you listen to the end to get the show notes info, and we'll link back to all the previous surrogacy conversations that we've had. But here's Natalie. So this is very exciting. Kate and I are sat next to each other for this episode of the podcast.
Indeed.
And really pleased to have pinned down the quite busy Natalie Gamble to talk about the amazing work that Natalie does in her law firm, Natalie Gamble Associates, especially around surrogacy. And first of all, Natalie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really nice to be here.
And I've known of you for a good while now. I've been in this space for 5 years, and I think you were one of the first kind of law firms that I saw doing work in this space. And I know that you've been very active in kind of campaigning in all the needs for changes to happen, which we'll talk more about. But it'd be great to get an idea as a starting point of your background, really, and what led you to be working in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, NGA Law has been going we just had our 10th birthday, and we were the first fertility law firm in the UK. So it's something that we've been doing as a kind of a real first and a sort of pioneering thing. But it didn't kind of come about with a grand vision. It was very much sort of accidental as a result of the experience that I'd been through. So I have 2 children with my wife, as she is now. They're now teenagers, our kids. And when we set about to start a family together, it was really difficult as a same-sex couple to access fertility treatment in the UK. There were only 2 fertility clinics that provided any kind of fertility treatment to people who weren't in heterosexual relationships. It seems astonishing these days, and it's really not that long ago. So we had to fight to get our treatment. And then when our daughter was born, we had no recognition as a family at all. So my wife and I, were not connected as partners. We couldn't get married at that time. And I was the birth mother, but she had no status in law whatsoever. So we went through a process of kind of battling to get the best rights that we could. And gradually over the years, the laws changed and developed, and we kind of kept kind of going up the scale, if you like. So we eventually were able to adopt both the children. So biologically mine, but my wife is now their full legal parent as well. And at each stage where we were going through those processes, we were one of the first people to be doing it. And, I grew up in a very liberal family. I found it surprising it was that difficult.
Yeah.
And, I was just qualifying as a lawyer, and I started kind of helping other people who were in a similar situation. And the whole fertility law thing just grew from there. So I ended up kind of working with more and more families who were conceiving children in different ways. So in same-sex relationships, through fertility treatment, through donation, and through surrogacy. And it was just something that kind of grew and grew. But for me, it's always been about, helping other people make their families possible, and also kind of winning legal recognition and acceptance. So the firm has always been kind of right at the forefront of pushing the boundaries of things. So we want to kind of change the rules, change the law, make things more inclusive, and allow families that, may feel marginalised and may feel kind of like they're doing things in a way that isn't, typical, that actually, they're just as valid as everyone else and they deserve the law to recognise them.
So you've really been able to figurehead this whole process, haven't you? And also with your own personal experience, that must be really reassuring for your clients who come and see you, that you really have an understanding of the pitfalls. Yeah, you've lived and breathed it.
Yeah, and I love it. It's so rewarding to meet people who are right at the beginning of their journeys, and often they come in and they feel very nervous about what they're doing, and they feel like, this is really unusual and it's something that not many people do. And to be able to say, you can do this, it's going to work, and this is how we can kind of find the solutions both practically and legally. Wanting to have a family is completely normal, and it's fine to do it in a different way. And your kids are going to be fine. You just need confidence, and you need openness and transparency, but it's all possible. It's lovely when, people come in and they're very nervous, and, they leave and they feel empowered and they feel strong to do what they're doing. And I feel very blessed to have a job where I can do that on a daily basis.
You're providing the reassurance as well as the logistical support from your own experience as well, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of experience of having kids who've grown up and been through it and, the challenges that it brings. So, yeah, no, it definitely helps.
Now, I've talked about the law around UK surrogacy on this podcast before, and I will link back to previous conversations as well as a series that I did with Surrogacy UK. But there's been so much that's happened since I shared that content. That was one of the reasons that we were really keen to catch up with you and get you to just talk a bit more about the changes that are being made in the surrogacy law and the work that's been going on with the Law Commission and the consultation around it. Can you talk us through that? Because, I know there's a lot there, isn't there?
Yeah, gosh, we could talk about this for hours. But we've been pushing for law reform on surrogacy for a really long time, but it really feels like it's gathered momentum in the last couple of years. So there's a few things that have happened. There was a case that we fought where we applied for parentage for a single dad who'd had a child through surrogacy in the US. And until quite recently, the law excluded single parents from being able to apply for parenthood if they had a child through surrogacy. So we took this case in order to challenge the law. And as a result of that case, the head of the High Court Family Division said that the law was discriminating, and they asked the government to change the law, which they subsequently did. But the judge also said that there had been lots of other cases where there had been kind of highlighted to have problems with surrogacy law, and they, recommended that it would be good for the government to ask the Law Commission to review the law. And I think that fed into, other momentum and discussions that had, been in the media and around about how surrogacy law was out of date. So the Law Commission began a 3-year project to review the law in 2018. And they started with, a lot of delving into what was going on and speaking to stakeholders and people who've been through the process in order to publish some provisional recommendations about how they think the law should change. So those recommendations were published this June, and they have just had a public consultation on those provisional recommendations. So they've asked for feedback from anyone in the public. That's just closed, which means that the Law Commission is now kind of looking at those responses. And going forward, they will then make some final recommendations over the next year or so, and the government will then make a decision about whether to implement that. But it is looking like we're about to get recommendations for a whole new system of surrogacy law in the UK.
Which is amazing.
And the recommendations are really positive. So they're very pro surrogacy, and one of the things that's been fantastic to see is the Law Commission say that there is acceptance now that surrogacy is a legitimate form of family building. So they're looking at very much kind of improving how the system works to recognise surrogacy and kind of respect what everybody is trying to achieve. So that's really positive. The detail of kind of what they're recommending is quite complicated, but to kind of give you the headlines, for people going through surrogacy in the UK, essentially what they're suggesting is that if people have followed certain sensible steps before conception, so things like putting things in writing, having counselling, getting legal advice, and having a regulated surrogacy organisation look at the arrangement to check that everybody is suitable and so on, that will then enable the intended parents to be the legal parents immediately from birth and to be registered on the birth certificate. So there's all sorts of complicated issues around, how that will work and what rights the surrogate has post-birth if she did want to change her mind and so on, that I think they're still working through. But that key change of recognising intended parents as legal parents from birth is really, really important. So that's really positive. They're also recommending that for people who go overseas for surrogacy, and bear in mind that's about half the parents through surrogacy that there currently are, the government should have the power to recognise some international surrogacy arrangements automatically. So for some people going overseas, they won't have to do anything further from a legal perspective. But again, there's detail to be worked out about how that's going to work and which countries it will affect and what happens to the people who don't fall within those automatic recognition procedures. But I mean, that's essentially, what they're suggesting, and we're really pleased about that.
So we know also that you're doing quite a lot of amazing work with Brilliant Beginnings. They work with both intended parents and surrogates. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Brilliant Beginnings, I set up with my business partner, Helen, in 2013. And it really grew out of us through our legal practice, seeing so many parents that were coming to us and making those decisions to go overseas for surrogacy because there was a lack of surrogates in the UK and because they wanted more structure and more kind of professional management and hand-holding through the process. So we wanted to help parents who wanted to stay in the UK to have access to that kind of more professionally managed process. So we set up Brilliant Beginnings, and in terms of the way that we deal with UK surrogacy, it's a process which is kind of unlike the other ways of doing surrogacy in the UK and much more kind of managed at every step. So surrogates, women who come forward wanting to work with us, we take them through a really rigorous process of giving them information, giving them support, enabling them to make informed choices. As part of that, they have counselling, they have legal advice, and they have a psychological assessment with a clinical psychologist, all of which kind of helps them, understand whether this is the right thing for them to do and to think about all those key decisions. We go through a similar process with intended parents, and then we do a bespoke kind of one-to-one match. So for surrogates, it means that the pressure is off them to sort of choose between, the very many deserving intended parents there are. And we're doing the legwork in helping them be matched with somebody who, is not only aligned on the really important issues like whether they can afford their expenses and, what their views would be if there was a need for a termination decision and those kind of really key important surrogacy issues, but also kind of more softly in terms of personality style and communication and what everyone's expectations are for the surrogacy journey. So we do the matching kind of for everybody, and we help them through that process where we'll kind of introduce them through a call initially and kind of getting to know each other. And we help them have all those discussions that then feed into a written agreement. We then have a kind of a process of mediation where the issues are kind of dealt with in detail to go into a written document. And from there, we kind of hold everybody's hand all the way through. So we're with them through their fertility treatment. Hopefully once there's a pregnancy established, we help them through the pregnancy as well, just making sure that everyone is communicating well, everybody does everything that they need to do at the right time, and that, we're there as that intermediary to ensure that everything goes smoothly. And we also help as well with the legal side of things and getting parenthood sorted and birth registration and so on. So it's a very kind of nurturing way of doing surrogacy where both the surrogates and the intended parents have got us to kind of trust and rely on to take them through the process and make it as smooth and easy as possible. So we're really passionate about that. And I know that the surrogates that we work with are really passionate about how we do things as well. We'd obviously, love to have more surrogates and be able to kind of help more intended parents through that journey. But sadly, with the law as the way it is at the moment, there aren't enough surrogates for the intended parents who need them. So through Brilliant Beginnings, we also help parents who do make the decision to go overseas. And in a similar way, we help project manage and guide them through the process of surrogacy in both the US and Canada as well.
Do you want to just talk a bit about some of the legal challenges of the parental orders abroad, if people are going abroad? Because whilst what you're doing is kind of creating this fully managed process, it still varies depending on the country, doesn't it?
Yeah, so once the baby's born, if you have a child through surrogacy abroad, I mean, lots of people do it because in the country where the child's born, so if you go to America or Canada or the Ukraine, the intended parents are recognised as the legal parents. But the big legal problem from the UK side is that UK law doesn't recognise that. So UK law will still treat the surrogate, whoever's given birth, as the legal mother. And if she's married, then her husband will be treated as the father. So you sometimes end up in situations where children are kind of stuck abroad because they're not entitled to British nationality, and there's a process to go through to bring them back through immigration. And even then, once the child comes back to the UK with the parents, there is that whole court process to go through in order to become the legal parents here as well as in the country of birth. And in international surrogacy cases, those applications are, increasingly well tested. Lots of people have done it, but they all go to high court judges, and there's quite a lot of information to produce in order to kind of get through the process. So it takes, usually between 4 and 9 months. And during that time, parents are kind of caring for their child, but they're not legally parents. So there's some kind of issues around that legal gap, if you like, between the status they should have and the status that they do have.
Is it fair to say that this whole process that you tried to put in place and what you explained before about what the law is kind of saying, that this will be recognised if you followed these steps, it's just trying to encourage people to come to people like yourselves and follow these guidelines to ultimately make the process as, I don't want to say seamless, but as straightforward as possible, because there's so much to consider?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I think the biggest problem with the law at the moment is that it doesn't kind of regulate or help surrogacy at the beginning at all. It's almost like it says, right, go away, find a surrogate if you can, have a baby. And then once the baby's born, we'll have a legal process at that stage. And it's a bit mad, really, for it all to happen after the event. So I think this idea of bringing it all forward so that, if you do sensible things at the beginning, then you get that benefit of being legal parents from birth. It's really sensible because it also helps avoid, problems and difficulties that, arise under the current system because people haven't thought things through properly or haven't talked about things or haven't taken enough time to get to know each other and build that strong relationship. So it's all very sensible in terms of, do the work at the start and then you won't have to do it at the end.
So, Natalie, with that in mind, what does doing the work at the start involve?
So I think it's about, first of all, making sure that, on the surrogate side, that the surrogate is somebody who, is in the right place herself to be doing this. So she's, healthy physically, that this isn't going to create a risk, an unfair risk for her in carrying a pregnancy, but that she's also in a good place emotionally and psychologically, and that, she's got the right support around her. From the intended parents as well, it's about, that they understand what's involved in a surrogacy journey, that they're prepared to kind of trust someone and invest in that relationship. Because, in the long run, we want to create friendships here and relationships that are going to last in the long term so that they'll be positive for the child. So it's making sure that everybody's in that space. And that is often about, assimilating a lot of information, understanding what the process is going to involve, the downs as well as the ups, that, things don't always go to plan and there are going to be bumps in the road and you need to be kind of prepared for that. It's also making sure you've talked through things that sometimes aren't that easy to talk through. So, key issues which people find difficult to talk about are the money side of things. So, what does the surrogate need in terms of her expenses? Is there going to be any element of kind of compensation? Is everybody clear about that?
I was reading on your website actually about, it's such a grey area, isn't it? The kind of both with the expenses that are given to the surrogate, and there seems to be no law saying how much or what is reasonable. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a really grey area, and because of that, it's a kind of breeding ground for confusion and anxiety and miscommunication. And I think being really clear is so important. So, I mean, people often report that it's illegal to pay a surrogate more than her expenses. Actually, the law isn't as simple as that. What happens is that there's no kind of criminal offences around this, and a surrogate can be paid anything. But when the parents apply to become the legal parents after the birth, it's one of those issues that the family court has to consider. But actually, there's a huge amount of case law now where the family court has made really clear that they'll authorise payments if the parental order is in the child's best interests. So in reality, there isn't really any regulation of what can be paid. And what we see on the ground is that it's quite common for surrogates to receive a bit extra in terms of, an expense for her pain and inconvenience and, everything that she's committing to this, and that's accepted quite routinely by the court. So there is this sort of fudging in terms of, people thinking it's expenses or perhaps talking about it as expenses. But if you were actually to kind of, in an accountancy way, like check that against people's out-of-pocket costs, there would be a gap in between, if you like. So I think, all of that is quite murky and messy, and I think it's really important for people to be clear about what they're agreeing and what's allowed, and making sure that there's no miscommunication between them.
I never forget when I spoke to surrogates and their partners, one of the partners said to me that they claimed for toilet paper because when their partner was pregnant, she was going to the toilet a lot, which made me howl.
So if we move on then from surrogacy, another area that I'm really keen to chat with you is how you support donor and co-parenting parents, and also kind of the common misconceptions that people might have about the legalities, and also what a donor parent or a co-parenting parents might face with regards to any pitfalls kind of along their journey.
Because I think co-parenting, it can seem like such a great idea.
I know, yes.
And then when reality hits, if there's nothing written down from the outset, it can get pretty complicated, can't it?
Yeah, and it's really interesting with this. I mean, it's the same messages as with surrogacy, really, about kind of communicating clearly at up front and setting things up in the best way possible. But within the legal practice, we kind of see both ends of the spectrum. So we see people coming to us saying, we want to set this up well, we want to put things in writing, what should we think about, what should we talk about? We also deal with people where they're involved in non-donational co-parenting arrangements further down the line, where things haven't worked out and they're now in dispute about, typically what the donor's role should be in the child's life, and we're then involved in, court proceedings to try and resolve that. So we can, often see the seeds of those disputes, if you like, what's kind of created those in those people in the early stages, and help them kind of avoid problems that might otherwise happen. And I think the most important thing here is about aligned expectations. So a lot of the disputed cases that we deal with are cases where, people went into this really positively and, feeling like they talked about things well, but actually not communicating clearly about what they wanted. And, it's very difficult, I think, to kind of put in words very clearly what you mean. So we get lots of people talking about, role models and uncle figures and those sorts of things, where you're talking about a donor stroke father, and those can mean completely different things to different people. So I think it's about, really bottoming out, how much involvement you want the donor to have. Are they going to be a co-parent? Are they going to be fully involved? Or are they going to be somebody that sees the child once or twice a year and is kind of there as on the periphery, but not actively involved in parenting? And when those things aren't worked out clearly at the beginning, that's when you get problems further down the line.
If people are listening and thinking, okay, there's a lot of information here, and the kind of idea of getting my head around all of it just seems quite terrifying, what would your advice be when it comes to non-traditional family building, which is what we're in essence trying to convey, that's not as scary as you might think? I mean, there is a lot to consider, isn't there?
There is. I mean, and the thing about non-traditional family building is that it's never an accident. So, everybody goes into this consciously and they're trying to achieve something. So I think it's just about taking your time, not rushing, being honest about what your expectations are, and then communicating clearly. And whether that's with a surrogate or a donor or a co-parent, or whether you are a donor and you're donating to recipients, I think just, taking your time to think all of that through properly is the most important thing. And there are fantastic sources of support out there to help you do that. I mean, counsellors at fertility clinics, there are wonderful organisations like the Donor Conception Network. You can come and see professionals like us in terms of the legal side, or on Brilliant Beginnings with the surrogacy side. So, there are lots of sources of support out there. So I think it's just about don't get overwhelmed by the information, but at the same time, kind of take your time to go through it and think about things carefully. But it's all very possible. And I think, we've moved from a place where 20 years ago, it was really difficult to have a family in a non-traditional way. Now there are so many different options and so many different ways of doing it, and so much information out there that it can feel overwhelming. But that also shows that there are so many opportunities as well. So I think it's about being grateful and realizing that those chances are there, and then managing that responsibly,
and
so
it's
that you
becoming
do
more
it the right way.
normalised, isn't it?
Oh
It's
yeah,
more
definitely.
commonplace.
Definitely. And the more families there are, the more visible those families are, the more that encourages other people. So I think it would just carry on getting more and more normalised.
Do you think as well the narrative in society about surrogacy is changing as people understand it more? It doesn't seem like such a weird thing of people buying babies.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in the past, people have thought, oh, it's something that celebrities do, but it's not something that kind of ordinary people do. And
It's
that's
always
not
had
the
quite a
case at
negative
all.
connotation, hasn't it? It's often
I
been
I
perceived in
think
that way previously,
there
maybe 20 years
there
ago.
is. Yeah, I mean, I think historically that's where the law came from, in terms of, making the surrogate the legal mother, and, not recognising surrogacy agreements, because at the time when surrogacy was very rare and not very understood, there was kind of an assumption that it was all likely to go horribly wrong, and that, quite commonly a surrogate would change her mind. So I think those fears are still out there, but once you start to kind of delve into the realities of surrogacy and how it works, you realise that those are myths and it's not really what happens. And certainly, from our experience, we've within the legal practice dealt with more than 1,200 surrogacy cases now, and of those, only two have involved disputes. So it's a tiny, tiny proportion. And I think, we've still got a way to go in educating people that surrogacy is, it is safe, it can be done ethically, it's not about people taking advantage of each other, it's not about buying babies, there isn't a big risk that the surrogate will change her mind. When surrogacy works well, it's a real positive collaboration between people, all of whom benefit, and a child comes into the world on the basis of that love and that collaboration and that being wanted. So I think we've made huge progress in changing that narrative, and surrogacy is much better accepted. But I think we're still working to correct some of those myths, and that will continue as well.
One of the things that I have heard, though, in different scenarios, when it's a surrogacy scenario with a heterosexual couple, or possibly more so with a same-sex couple, is this issue of car park handovers, and that the all the hard work that you're talking about and that's been happening with the changing in the law hasn't necessarily yet got through to the hospital staff. And I just wondered what you felt about that, because that's an educational process that needs more attention, doesn't it?
It is, but it also comes from the deficiencies of the law,
Right.
because hospitals are very nervous about the fact that it's the surrogate who's the legal mother, and she's the one that should be making decisions, and that leads to the whole kind of, well, who are the intended parents, and should we be allowing them to take the baby if they don't have any legal responsibility? So I think law reform will make a big difference to those kinds of issues.
And I can completely,
but it is outrageous,
I can
that it
completely
happens.
appreciate that, actually, from working in a clinical environment myself. I can completely appreciate how difficult that must be for hospital staff, because we have to work so closely to the law and be aware of patient confidentiality and treating the patient and everything. So I can imagine there'll be a real conflict there for health professionals.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Department of Health did some work last year that we were involved in as well, and they've produced a document for health professionals, which essentially says, we know the law isn't there, but surrogacy is now accepted, and we expect health professionals to treat everybody sensitively. So that's been really helpful in terms of having that government endorsement. But I think until we get law reform, those problems are not entirely going to go away.
How do you feel, Natalie, about people making the decision to stay in the UK for surrogacy? Because I know it's something that Two Dads UK are trying to really advocate, as far as for gay men wanting to go down the surrogacy route to kind of stay put. Do you feel that there's more of a shift back to staying put?
I mean, we work with parents making the choice both to stay in the UK and to go overseas. And we did some research with Cambridge University last year to look at the motivations of people going overseas. And interestingly, most of the people who go overseas would prefer to stay in the UK, but they don't feel, for various different reasons, that they have that option. So the biggest thing is that there aren't enough surrogates in the UK at the moment. And what that means is that people don't have a kind of certain process or timescale for being able to have their families. And certainly for those who feel that the clock's ticking, the kind of attraction of going overseas is that there's certainty around finding a surrogate. So I think people will gravitate back to staying in the UK if there are more surrogates here. And I think, again, I keep coming back to this, but I think law reform will help with that, as well as greater awareness. Ideally, our vision would be that everybody who wants to have a surrogacy in the UK has the opportunity to do that, and that the people who go overseas are the ones that choose that rather than the ones that feel that they're forced to. We really support UK surrogacy and we really want to see it grow and thrive, but we've got a way to go with that.
In your experience, Natalie, what's the main reason why a woman may decide she wants to be a surrogate? What brings her to that decision?
Oh, surrogates are the most amazing.
They are amazing.
They're so, yeah, I mean, it's so fantastic. And, they don't see themselves as being so amazing, but they are. And I think it's because of that. We find with the surrogates that come to Brilliant Beginnings that they're, usually mums who, are very family oriented. They couldn't imagine life without their children. And they have that thing where they think, gosh, if I hadn't been able to have my kids, I, would need someone to help me. So why shouldn't I do that for someone else? This is something I can do. And it comes very much from that place of I can do it, so why wouldn't I? It is that altruistic motivation, that, desire to help other people have families. And I think it's so empowering to feel that, there are people out there that have, they've tried the fertility treatments, all these doctors and professors haven't been able to make it happen for them, but I can do this. I can, make a family for someone else. And it's often women who've been touched by infertility, either themselves or with a family member. Sometimes it's same-sex couples who have had children with the help of a donor, and then they feel like they want to give back to a gay couple. So there are lots of reasons, but they all come from such a positive place.
And I love the stories of the friendships that form with intended parents and surrogates, and then they might have their children be friends growing up, and I think it's an amazing community. Natalie, thank you.
And that's really typical, that that long relationship, because you go through this thing together that is kind of so life-changing that how could you not then be friends forever? It's amazing.
Yeah, and an extended family.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's optimistic, isn't it?
It's really optimistic, and I'm always an optimist, and I think you change the world by pushing the boundaries. We're not going to stop till it's sorted.
Everyone needs somebody like yourself out there fighting for their corner.
Right, that was a lot of information, wasn't it?
It was, and I think what we realised, Natalie, when we were thinking about the conversations that we wanted to have with Natalie, and so confusing that I'm saying two Natalies, if anyone listened to the last episode, we had two Kates. We had Kate Kaufman and Kate Davis.
We're only going to interview people that have one of our names.
Oh, God, how confusing is that? But when we were considering what the questions that we wanted to ask Natalie and the things that we wanted to go through, we could have had a list that was long as our arm. There was so much that we wanted to talk to her about. So I think definitely we'll be talking to her again.
Yeah. And hopefully all that information hasn't just come across as being too overwhelming, because there is a lot to take on. And I think one of the key things is to get advice early on if you're thinking of going down this non-traditional family route. Get as much advice as possible. Don't be put off by the idea of speaking to a law firm, because ultimately they are there to help, and as Natalie said, so dedicated to the cause.
100%. And I think what's so impressive and probably very unique about Natalie is that she has
other Natalie.
Yeah, and you're unique, is that she's gone through this journey herself. So to really appreciate and understand it from the point of view of a couple going through either surrogacy or donor is just incredible. And it was so interesting, wasn't it, to hear about Brilliant Beginnings and their website. I was having a look while we were chatting. The website is fantastic and so informative. So I think I'd encourage anybody to make that perhaps their first port of call for information.
Well, the show notes for this episode are thefertilitypodcast.com/surrogacy law. Go and have a look. You'll get Natalie's details and the website and the details for Brilliant Beginnings, as Kate just mentioned. And of course, both of our socials, so you can follow us and get in touch. I'm at FertilityPoddy on Insta and Twitter.
And I'm at Your Fertility Journey on Insta and Fert Journey on Twitter.
Thank you as always for your support. And until next time,